In the early decades of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. For centuries, it had been one of the world's most formidable powers, controlling vast territories across 3 continents. But by the 1900s, the empire was weakening. Its military had suffered defeats, its treasury was strained, and European powers were encroaching on its borders. Yet within the empire's leadership, there was little consensus about how to respond. What followed was not a single catastrophic decision, but a series of choices that compounded over time. Each seemed reasonable in isolation. Each was made by officials who believed they were acting in the empire's best interest. Together, they would contribute to one of the most expensive miscalculations in modern history. The Ottoman government faced mounting debts. Years of modernization efforts, military campaigns, and administrative reforms had depleted its finances. European banks had extended loans, but repayment terms were growing harsher. By 1881, the empire had defaulted on its external debt, leading to the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a European-controlled body that managed much of the empire's revenue. This arrangement created a paradox. The empire retained formal sovereignty, but its financial decisions were increasingly constrained by foreign creditors. Ottoman officials could see the problem clearly. They understood that dependence on European capital was eroding their autonomy. Yet, they also believed that modernization required continued investment, and that investment required foreign money. Records indicate that several advisors within the government recommended reducing expenditures and focusing on internal economic development. But these voices were often drowned out by more urgent concerns. The empire was surrounded by threats. Russia pressed from the north. Britain and France maneuvered in the Mediterranean. Nationalist movements were gaining strength in the Balkans. To many decision-makers, austerity seemed like a luxury the empire could not afford. Instead, the government continued borrowing. New loans were taken to service old debts. Infrastructure projects moved forward, often at inflated costs, due to contracts awarded to European firms. The military underwent expensive reorganizations, purchasing equipment from abroad rather than developing domestic industry. Each decision was justified by immediate need, but the long-term trajectory was becoming unsustainable. Historians suggest that part of the problem was a cognitive trap. Ottoman elites were accustomed to thinking of their state as a great power. They had inherited an empire that once dictated terms to Europe. Accepting a diminished role felt not just politically unpalatable, but culturally unthinkable. This mindset made it difficult to pursue policies that might have reduced costs, but would have required acknowledging the empire's reduced status. The situation worsened after 1908 when the Young Turk Revolution brought a new government to power. The new leadership promised reform and revitalization. They invested heavily in education, transportation, and military modernization. These were not reckless expenditures. They were attempts to strengthen the state. But they were also expensive, and they deepened the empire's reliance on external financing. Then came the decision that would prove most costly. In 1914, as Europe descended into war, Ottoman leaders faced a choice. They could remain neutral, preserving their resources and avoiding entanglement in a conflict between great powers. Or they could align with one side, hoping that victory would restore lost territories and secure the empire's future. The decision to enter the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary was not made lightly. It was debated within the government. Some officials warned of the risks, but others argued that neutrality was itself dangerous, that the empire would be carved up by the victors regardless, and that only active participation could guarantee a seat at the peace table. Evidence points to a belief among key decision-makers that the war would be short. They expected a swift German victory, followed by negotiations in which Ottoman interests would be protected. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The war lasted 4 years. It drained the empire's already depleted treasury. It cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and it ended not in victory, but in total defeat. The financial cost was staggering. Historians estimate that the Ottoman Empire spent the equivalent of billions in today's currency on the war effort. Much of this was borrowed, adding to an already unmanageable debt burden. Infrastructure was destroyed. Agricultural production collapsed. Entire regions were depopulated. The empire's economy, which had been fragile before the war, was left in ruins. But the true cost extended beyond finances. The war accelerated the empire's disintegration. Arab provinces revolted. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. The empire that had endured for 6 centuries ceased to exist, replaced by a much smaller Turkish republic and a patchwork of new states across the Middle East. Looking back, it is easy to identify the mistakes: the reliance on foreign debt, the refusal to accept diminished status, the decision to gamble on a war that the empire was ill-prepared to fight. But these were not the actions of foolish or incompetent leaders. They were the products of a system under enormous pressure, making decisions with incomplete information and limited options. What makes this history particularly instructive is how gradually the mistakes accumulated. There was no single moment of obvious failure. Each loan seemed manageable. Each investment seemed justified. Each strategic decision seemed like the least bad option available. It was only in retrospect that the pattern became clear. The Ottoman experience illustrates a common dynamic in institutional failure. When faced with decline, organizations often double down on past strategies rather than fundamentally rethinking their approach. They continue spending to maintain prestige. They take risks to avoid accepting a diminished role. And they convince themselves that the next decision will reverse their fortunes, even as evidence accumulates to the contrary. The empire's leaders were not blind to their predicament. Archives contain countless memoranda and policy debates in which officials grappled with the empire's financial crisis. But awareness of a problem is not the same as the ability to solve it. Structural constraints, competing priorities, and the weight of historical expectations all limited what was politically and practically possible. The consequences of these choices extended far beyond the empire's collapse. The debts accumulated during this period had to be negotiated for decades afterward. The new Turkish Republic inherited a devastated economy and spent years rebuilding. The political boundaries drawn after the war created instabilities that persist to the present day. The cost was not just measured in money, but in lost possibilities. Resources that might have been invested in education, industry, or public health were instead consumed by debt service and military expenditures. A generation that might have built a more prosperous society was instead sent to fight in a war that left the empire weaker than before. What began as a series of financial decisions aimed at preserving a great power ended in the dissolution of that power entirely. The empire's wealth, accumulated over centuries, could not mask the fundamental unsustainability of its position. By the time the full scale of the problem became undeniable, it was far too late to change course. The mistakes had compounded, the debts had multiplied, and the cost had become impossible to bear.